Verse 39 of Luke 22 is where we're starting today. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and the sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation." While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this," and he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. But when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." And Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Christ," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You're right in saying I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." And thus began the most radical injustice of history. They shouldn't even have been meeting in the early morning, because, as with almost every court, it's got to be in daylight, not to be in the night. And they were meeting long before sunrise. And it was a Jewish court. We need to remember that. And I'll tell you why at the end. Well, now, everything seemed to be in threes, so that's why I put the outline in threes for you. Jesus is central to each of the situations, and the people decide for themselves what their attitude towards him is going to be. That's the sort of shape of the passage. And the first shows Jesus agonizing in Gethsemane. And the three things of Jesus in Gethsemane are, first, that he was shrinking from a cup which he was to drink. Now that's a very interesting phrase, because it tells us that Jesus was not as brave as the others who were going to be crucified. Apparently, he was shrinking from it. Now, many people were crucified in those days, including 2 thieves, as we shall see. And many of them went bravely to their death. They did not shrink from it as he did. And he was really in terrific torment about the whole idea. And we only realize why when you look at the word cup. What was this cup he was so reluctant to drink? Well, as with most things in the New Testament, the clue lies in the Old Testament, where the cup was always a symbol of God's anger and God's wrath. A cup that sinners needed to drink to the dregs. And this was surely the cup that Jesus was shrinking from. He realized that for the first time ever, he and his Father were going to be separated. And for the first time ever, his Father would be angry with him. And he knew what that would be. And so he shrank from it. He'd enjoyed his Father's company all the way through. And everything he said, he claimed the Father was telling him to say. And now there was to be a break in their relationship. And this is due to the fact that the Father was going to desert him. As soon as our sin was put on Jesus, his own Father was going to have to turn his back. That's the secret of the cross. And it's a secret that many are reluctant to accept, because it tells us that God himself was going to turn his back on his own Son. And he was under such pressure that the sweat became drops of blood on his forehead. And the doctors will tell you that that's a sign of extreme stress, when you are under such pressure that from the pores of the forehead, blood is expressed. And it was falling on the ground. The first blood of Jesus to be shed for you, actually, was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And what added to his problems was that the disciples were all asleep. They were exhausted with sorrow. They also knew that something terrible was about to happen. And it's again one of the human facilities almost, that when we're really facing horror, sleep is very welcome. And so the disciples were sleeping out of sheer sorrow. And he went back to them and said, "Why are you sleeping?" The one time he needed companionship and help and support. And it tells us here that an angel came and gave Jesus moral support. If you don't believe in angels, you'll have problems with the whole Bible, and particularly with the story of Jesus. The angels are there at his birth, at his temptations in the wilderness, and time and again the angels step in. The only point where they don't and where they didn't support him was when he died on the cross. But in Gethsemane, angels were standing by him when the disciples were not. Very interesting. Now, at his arrest, which, by the way, was by the temple soldiers, not Romans, Jewish soldiers came to arrest him, led by Judas. So we've got Jesus the Jew, betrayed by a Jew, arrested by Jews. These are his fellow countrymen. And after his arrest in the garden, he rebukes three people. First, he rebukes Judas. "Judas, you betrayed me with a kiss." And that was the secret sign that Judas had arranged with the authorities of the temple. You'll know who to arrest. He'll be in the middle of a crowd, so the one I kiss is the leader. But what a sign to choose, because it was an expression of love, a profound expression of loyalty. "Judas, are you going to betray me with a kiss?" That was the first rebuke. Then he had to rebuke Peter. Remember that Peter was one of those who said, "We've got a sword," and Jesus said, "That's enough." And Peter now used the sword he'd got to slice a man's ear. One of the guards who had arrested Jesus, and Peter, remembering what Jesus had said, "You now need to take a sword." And Jesus had meant to protect yourselves, not to protect me. He never told them to use the sword to protect him. He was talking about their future when they would need protection. And dear Peter, always the impetuous Peter, sliced the man's ear off. And Jesus said, "Peter, that's not the way. I didn't tell you to take a sword to protect me." That's what he meant. And he healed the man's ear. His name was Malchus, and he later became part of the first church. That's not here, but I'm just telling you, we know from elsewhere that Malchus not only got an ear healed by Jesus, but he got his heart healed by Jesus and became part of the church. And the third rebuke on Jesus' lips was, he rebuked the soldiers for coming in darkness. He said, "I've been openly teaching in the temple every day in full daylight, and you could have come and arrested me anywhere. But here you are coming in darkness." And he was shaming them too, because it's only when you want to hide from people what you're doing that you choose darkness rather than daylight. And he told them, "You shouldn't be doing this, but this is your hour when darkness reigns." And certainly there's a moral darkness here. And then comes the most tragic story of all, I think, when Peter denied that he had anything to do with Jesus. And Jesus had told him that he would. Do you remember in the last study, Peter had said to Jesus, "Even if they all leave you, I will stay faithful. I'll go to prison with you. I'll even die with you. You'll always have one companion with you. And Jesus said, Peter, before the cock crows tomorrow morning, you'll deny me 3 times. That shows that Jesus had the pre-knowledge of God. And so it turned out. In the courtyard of Caiaphas, where they were waiting for Jesus to go on trial, they kindled a fire and they were warming their hands around the fire, including Jesus now with ropes on, arresting him. And a servant girl, a little girl, said, Peter, you're one of his, aren't you? And Peter betrayed the Lord to a servant girl and said, I don't know him. No connection. That was the first. Then another standing by said, but you are one of his. No, I'm not. And he actually, from another gospel we know, began to swear that he did not know Jesus. And then a third time, somebody said, but you are a Galilean, you're from up north, you've got the accent of someone who would be with Jesus. And Peter was absolutely furious. Man, I don't know what you're talking about. And then the cock crew. 3 times he denied Christ. And then 3 things happened. 1, the cock crew. And 2, the worst thing of all, Jesus himself, who was there bound and waiting trial, turned and looked at Peter. That look must have been terrible. It can't have been a look of triumph. I was right, Peter. Now you see, I predicted this. I don't think Jesus for a moment would gloat over being right. I think it must have been a very disappointed look. Peter, you too? The other disciples had all gone. Peter was the only one who'd followed and was now in the Caiaphas house in the courtyard. And that's where I stood with some of our own church members on one occasion I told you about last time. And we all heard a cock crow. And it was the most significant moment. I think all of us were thinking, Lord, would I have done that? And the answer, of course, is yes. Why did Peter deny him? I think the only answer is cowardice. And that he was so scared for his own skin now that he was afraid and just couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that he was with Jesus. And the third thing that happened, and this I can understand, Peter went out and wept bitterly. It must have been a dreadful moment for Peter when Jesus had said, I know you're not the brave man that you think you are. I know you'll deny me 3 times. And now he'd done it. And Jesus just looked at him sadly, disappointedly. And Peter was broken-hearted by that look and just went out and wept bitterly all on his own. There's an interesting sequel to this, which we get from another gospel. Just a few days after his resurrection, Peter went fishing. Typically Peter, he just couldn't stand hanging around in Galilee waiting for something to happen. And he said, I'm going fishing. And he went fishing. And they toiled all night and caught nothing. And then when the sun went up, there was Jesus standing on the shore, though they didn't know it was him. And Jesus said, "You're doing it all wrong. Throw your net the other side of the boat." Now, my advice is, if you see anybody fishing and they're not catching anything, give them the benefit of your advice. You won't find that very welcome. But when a fisherman's caught nothing for all his efforts, he's just wide open to your counsel and your advice and your wisdom. At least I don't think so, but it's interesting, this unknown figure on the shore after the resurrection said, "Throw your net the other way." And they did, and they caught 153 fish in one throw. There's been so much discussion about why 153. And I think that the funniest one is, if you take 12 apostles and multiply them by 12, you get to 144. And if you take the three persons of the Trinity and multiply them by 3, you get 9. And 144 plus 9 equals 153. Silly. But you'd be amazed what people make of some of the details in Scripture. But they're caught. My explanation is very simple. That's a lot of fish. And then they realized that the man on the shore was Jesus. And Peter said to John, "That's Jesus." And jumped over the side of the boat and splashed his way ashore. Now, the shore there, I've been to the very place, is pebbles. It's all stones. And somebody, I don't know who, has taken 3 of the stones about this size and cut them into the shape of a heart. And so among the pebbles today, you can look for 3 hearts in a row, spread out among the other stones. And that's a reminder that it was on that shore that Jesus healed Peter's heart, because it's only 2 occasions in the gospel story where there's a charcoal fire mentioned. One was where Peter denied the Lord, and the other was after the resurrection, where Jesus had cooked breakfast for them and lit a fire. And when Peter came dashing ashore, all wet, he looked at the fire and remembered. And then Jesus 3 times said to Peter, "Do you love me, Peter?" More than the other disciples. And Jesus was deliberately going through that 3 denials at the other fire to put right with Peter. And it must have done that. There's something even more interesting. There are different words for love in the Greek language. And the first time Jesus said to Peter, "Do you love me more than these others?" And Peter replied, "You know everything. I'm not going to say what's not true. I like you enormously." Wouldn't use the word love. And so Jesus came down to Peter's level and said, "Peter, do you just like me?" And Peter said, "You know everything, Lord. You know I like you." He wouldn't say the word love. And so Peter was told, "Feed my sheep. You're the first pastor of the flock." But that's another story after the resurrection. But it's interesting that Jesus said 3 times to him around another fire, "Do you love me? Do you like me?" What a master Jesus was at picking people up and healing their hearts. Now, the temple soldiers took Jesus away for trial. And one of the perks of being a soldier was that they were free to do anything they liked with the prisoner. It was their privilege to mock prisoners. And so they began to mock Jesus and insult him. They'd heard that he was being tried to be a king, and so they got thorns and made a ring of them and clamped that down on his forehead. That must have been very painful for a start, because the thorns in Israel are huge. The spikes are about 2 to 3 inches long. And to jam those on his forehead was to shed more blood. That's the second time his blood was shed. And they even found a purple robe to put on him. And they mocked him as a king. And they beat him. Now, one of the things that I've noticed on the Turin shroud is that the marks of a beating are all over the back of the man who the shroud was covering. And when I say beating, a Roman flog was terrible. The whip had different strands, and along these strands of cord were tied bits of metal, bits of bone, the shape of dumbbells. So when they hit the body, they made a scar of 2 ends, if you can imagine that. And the Turin shroud, the back of it, is covered with these dreadful whippings. And the soldiers were allowed to do that, and they did it. They flogged him, and it must have got right through to the bones and flayed the skin to bits. And then they insulted him further by blindfolding him, and they took turns to hit him and said, "Now prophesy. Tell us who hit you." Now, all this is pretty rough, crude, and cruel. But they were allowed to do it. It was not God's will that that should ever happen to Jesus. It was never allowed to the Jews to torture a lamb before they sacrificed it. And that's what's been happening here. So all this was extra. God did predict his death and indeed demand it, but he didn't demand the torture beforehand. And Jesus went through all that for me and for you, but it was not God's plan. God had planned his death, but with every sacrifice, and there were hundreds of thousands of deaths of animals, there was a quick, clean death. No torturing. But with Jesus, he was tortured before he died. And so we come to the first part of his trial. And remember, it's the Jewish court still that is trying him. It's not yet the Roman court. And the Jews were determined to find him guilty of blasphemy. For that, in the Jewish law, was a capital crime. It still is in the Muslim law, which is another body of law that's come out of the same area of the Middle East. And as you know, that's why Salman Rushdie, he had to be protected from his death, because they reckoned his novel, The Satanic Verses, was blasphemous, and therefore worthy of death. And the Muslims had no hesitation in condemning Salman Rushdie to death. He's still alive, of course. He was protected by British justice. But there was no protection for Jesus. And they were trying him on the capital crime of blasphemy. And if they could find out a blasphemous remark of Jesus, he was a dead man. He was being tried by Jewish law. And so 3 of his titles came up for discussion. The first was the title, the Christ. And they demanded of him, are you the Christ? Now, the Christ is not a surname of Jesus. It's almost the word majesty. It's the Messiah is the expected king who would deliver them from all their enemies. And for centuries, they looked for the Messiah to come. And there were many false claims to be the Messiah. And Jesus warned us about them too. Those who come and say, I am he. I'm the one you're looking for. And Jesus was being asked, are you the Christ? Tell us. And he said, if I told you, you wouldn't believe me. And you certainly would never call me that yourselves. And so they moved on to a second because he did. He said, but from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God. That was the truth. Now, Son of Man, I've told you this before, but I'll say it again, is a title that was used over 80 times in the book of Ezekiel, where it simply means human being. And whenever God spoke to Ezekiel, he always addressed him as Son of Man. But there is one verse in the Old Testament, in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, where there's another Son of Man, this time in capital letters, as it were, who is going to come in the clouds of heaven and who will return to heaven after he has been here. And that's the Son of Man that Jesus picked up. Not the 80 times in Ezekiel, but the one time in Daniel where it refers to a divine person, not just a human person. And he said, you'll see the Son of Man seated in the right hand of God from now on. And that was a direct claim. So much so that all of them asked, well, are you the Son of God then? And this time he said, you are right in saying, I am. And there on his own lips he was claiming to be the Son of God. I am. You know the significance of that. When Jesus said, I am the bread of life, I am the door of the sheep, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Every time he said that, they recognized he was claiming to be God, because he emphasized, I am, by duplicating the word I. Ego eimi was what he said every time in Greek. And ego, you know what that means, I, egotism, ego, I. Eimi also means I am. So Jesus, when he used two words together, was saying, I am. And that they knew as the name of God from the days of Moses. And so at last they had evidence for his blasphemy from his own lips. You are right in saying, I am. And they said, we need no more testimony. He's condemned himself out of his own mouth, which was, again, illegal. You could not condemn a man out of his own mouth. You could condemn him out of other people's mouths. But we know from other Gospels that they couldn't find witnesses to agree. And Jesus was put to death, not for what he was, not for what he'd done, but for what he said about himself. On the charge of blasphemy alone, he deserved to die. And so the trial was over, as far as the Jewish trial was concerned. But then they had a big problem. Blasphemy was a capital crime under Jewish law, under Moses' law, but it was not a crime under Roman law. And the Roman occupation of the land had forbidden the Jews ever to execute. They could only execute a person by reporting that person under Roman law. And this was the greatest injustice of Jesus' trial. The Jews tried him for blasphemy and found him guilty, but that wouldn't have washed with Pontius Pilate, who was there as a Roman to govern with Roman law. And so they now had to go to Pilate and persuade Pilate that he deserved death. Roman law never condemned a man for blasphemy. And that's really the dilemma they had. They had now found him guilty out of his own mouth, which is illegal, and they could not execute him, for that was illegal in the Romans' eyes. And so they had to transfer him to Pilate. And not only transfer him, but change the charge. And they changed it to treason. And we shall see next that they charged him with treason, that he was upsetting everybody, and that he was denying paying taxes to the Romans, which he was not, and that he was claiming to be the king of the Jews, which of course was treason. And that explains why he was passed to Pilate, as we shall see. Well, now, as you can see, these are all incidents building up to the cross, which was the greatest miscarriage of justice in the human history. Never was an innocent man put to death as Jesus was. And you can see how they'd made up their minds that he was going to die before they tried him. They were determined to get rid of him. And that's the real truth of the cross. And yet it was not just men who were doing it, but God. And that's the biggest mystery of all, until you realize that Jesus was dying to pay for everybody else's sins, not his own. Thank you again for listening.